Hello and welcome to the Vine Life Podcast. I'm Tony Clark, your host, and today my special guest is Dr. Steve Miller. And Steve is an educator, and he teaches in the Inter-disciplinary Studies Department at Kennesaw State University. And I hope I pronounced that correctly. He's a researcher. He's a researcher, entrepreneur, and speaker, having taught audiences from Atlanta to Moscow. He has studied at several prestigious universities. He's also known for drawing practical wisdom from serious research about near-death experiences and communicating that in an accessible and unforgettable way. So, Dr. Steve, thank you so much for coming on the program today.
Thanks for having me, Tony.
Absolutely. So near-death experience, to me, it's a fascinating subject, and I've seen your interviews and so forth, and I've seen the books and the articles that you've written. I just wanted to get you on the program and just ask you a few questions, but let's get a backstory if we can first, as always. What first interested you, Steve, in near-death experiences? What whet your appetite to study NDEs?
I think I need to go all the way back to high school. Went on a retreat my sophomore year in high school because a girl I liked was going. And when I got there, somebody acquainted me with John 10:10, where Jesus said he came to give us an abundant life. And I thought, what am I doing fooling around outside of God's will and missing out on his best? So I just made a decision, no big emotions going on. It just seemed practical to me. But after that time, indeed, God changed my life in a lot of significant ways, never been the same. But I have a very skeptical mind about things. And whereas a lot of my people could just take things at face value about their faith, God, the Bible, Jesus, all these things, whenever skeptics would say certain things, I would have to study them out. I'd have to read one side, read the other side, think them through. And so a lot of my academic career in 3 undergraduate schools and 2 graduate schools, 3 actually now, were studying these evidences and getting the tools of Greek and Hebrew and logic and all these things to study. I worked through those doubts, came through them. A lot of apologists, Christian apologists, helped me out with their writings. But I never came across this near-death experience thing. I just assumed that if people were having private experiences, that was something for them, but how could that be evidence for anyone else? I never explored them. And besides the near-death experience thing, it sounded a little new agey or something. It seemed like it was on the fringes, and I'd never seen apologists talk about it. So about 12 years ago, a relative wanted me to read the little book, Heaven is for Real, about the little boy who claimed to have had a near-death experience, his pastor father, Todd Burpo. And so I read it as a favor. And when I read it, I thought, well, this is very uplifting if you believe the family, but I don't know the family. I don't know why they're writing. There's a potential profit motive whenever somebody writes a book about their own experience that others can't look at, and you know, you have to have a lot of documentation there. But in the book, one of the blurbs was by a physician, Dr. Long, who said, I've studied thousands of these experiences, and this is consistent with what I've seen. And I thought, people have been studying these? So I thought, I need to see who's been studying it and what they found out. So I was shocked to find that since 1975, when Raymond Moody wrote the book Life After Life, which really popularized near-death experiences, that there had been many studies by very capable researchers studying multiple cases within their patients that they personally interviewed and could compare doctor records with. And I was just shocked. And within that, I said, you know, this is a very good case for God in the afterlife. Why haven't Christians been all over this? So that's really what got me into the study. I was amazed to see that there was actually evidence there and great studies had been done. So I wasn't one to go on YouTube and just look for experiences from people I'd never heard or to read the paperback books. I wanted to see the studies themselves and consolidate that so that people would look at what the evidence had shown over the years.
Steve, you mentioned something about being skeptical there, and you mentioned a book that probably wasn't should have been more researched before it was written, and I think that's what we run into many times in Christian circles, is we have a tendency to believe anything because it's on the internet. But you've also got a book, and I want to touch on this a little bit. I think it's called Building a Foundation, Why Brilliant People Believe Nonsense,
Yes.
a practical text for critical and creative thinking. And before we get into near-death experiences and the ones that you've researched and the conclusions that you've come to, let's talk about that a little bit. Having a critical thinking and why it's so important before we believe these stories, because I can think of many folks with a lot of degrees on college campuses today, many college professors that have a lot of degrees, and they're probably very intelligent, but they're talking nonsense. They don't know the difference between the genders. They think it's okay to put up with anti-Semitism, and I won't get into all of that, but they're spewing nonsense, but they have a lot of intelligence, a lot of degrees. So talk about your book, if you would, Why Brilliant People Believe Nonsense, a practical text for critical and creative thinking. Why is that so important?
By the way, I'm just not out to sell books. I actually wrote that book for a class that probably doesn't exist most places. I just felt like it needed to be written so people can access it free on Kennesaw State University Digital Commons. So J. Steve Miller, the letter J. Steve Miller, and you can read it. What I found was that I was working with incoming freshmen at the time, introducing them to college, helping them to try to be successful as college students, and I found that hardly any of them had studied critical thinking before they got there. The more I started teaching at KSU and teaching upper level religion classes, I found that hardly anybody was prepared to study out some truth claim. In other words, they were able to read a textbook and spit back what the professor wanted them to say. They could hear a lecture and pass a test on it, but that's quite different from saying, why should I believe what this textbook is saying, or why should I believe what my professor just said? So I thought, we need to find out what has happened with critical thinking. Why have we missed out on actually passing this on to our students? And how can we, in a practical way, show them? And I thought, well, a good way is to look at not a lot of logic books and critical thinking books will point out the really stupid things that people believe and apply it to that. I said, no, let's take some of the most brilliant, successful people ever and see how they made mistakes. And I think that points out to us a lot. Like Einstein didn't really want to make the change from the older science of Newton to getting into quantum physics. There were some things that just didn't sit well with him with that. Believing the Big Bang Theory, that there was actually a beginning to the universe. He said, well, I don't know, that sounds too much like creation. So he resisted it. Why would a brilliant scientist resist the evidence? Well, I think we've got paradigms we get into. We get ways of thinking. And often, some of the best scientists, some of the most brilliant people, don't realize that they're set in their ways and they think that all they're seeing is evidence, where actually they're like everybody else. They tend to believe the evidence for things they want to believe.
Yeah, and I just wanted to kind of build a foundation that how much research you've actually put into near-death experiences, and you've written this book about, critical thinking and creative thinking and so forth. As far as how does critical thinking apply to near-death experiences? What type of research did you do when you researched these near-death experiences? What type of criteria did you have? What type of checklist did you do before you said, hey, this experience is possibly legitimate and this experience is not legitimate?
Sure. Well, the methodology I'm using is very common to science. You would take two hypotheses and say, okay, so let's just introduce the experience for people who don't don't know it, but a near-death experience is one in which a person, let's say they have a heart attack and they experience clinical death, no breathing, cessation of heartbeat. Their brain should quickly, within a few seconds, shut down, be incapable of consciousness or laying down memories. If it could do anything, it would be extremely shallow at that point, if anything is going on in the brain. So the question is this just, why do people have these experiences where they come back and say, ooh, it wasn't just that I had some kind of vague dream or vague notion, but this was like the most conscious I've been in my life. It was not only real, many would say it was realer than the reality we're experiencing talking right now. And they would say that they saw themselves exit their bodies, saw the people working on their bodies trying to get their heart started, and could actually talk about things, very specific things going on in that room or near the auto accident, wherever the accident happened. They would talk about talking to angels, and if they had a distressing near-death experience, there might be demonic entities that are telling them lies or scaring them in many ways. People will typically have their lives reviewed. They'll see scenic vistas. They'll often have answer the question or discuss the question as to whether they should go on and stay on the other side, be fully dead, or return. But then, of course, they do return and recover, and they have this experience to talk about. Okay, so there are two ways to explain this, basically. Two hypotheses. One, the dying brain theory, which would say these are just things in your brain, squirting off in your brain, happen at death, and that explains why you would have a hallucination at death. The dying brain theory. And then there would be the afterlife theory, which says, no, it looks like the evidence is that somebody has actually come out of their body and is looking down at these things. So I think, as in science, we put up two hypotheses. If there are others, figure them out. That's what hypotheses all about. They're theories on probation until we look at the evidence. And then so we look at the evidence of really almost 50 years of near-death experience research now and say, which of these two theories or hypotheses best fit with the data? So that's the way I approached it. What did I look at? I did not go on YouTube and just start looking for experiences. The reason is YouTube has an algorithm, and in all probability, it's going to feed you more anomalous experiences because it's going to feed you the ones that most people have liked, which are the most interesting experiences. And besides, I don't know these people out there on the internet. So I said, let's stick with the best research that's been done. People like Dr. Sabom, who is a cardiologist who taught cardiology at Emory, who did a study of near-death experiences in the 1970s. Dr. Pim van Lommel in the Netherlands, who did a study of his cardiac patients and actually published it in The Lancet, which is one of the top medical journals anywhere, and wrote a book on it. So what did these researchers find? Because they could screen out patients who had mental problems or were on drugs, all these things that when you're getting things from just the internet, you don't know what their motives or their backgrounds may be. So I wanted to look at their experiences and see which was the best fit. And it, to me, for about 12 different lines of evidence fit better with the afterlife hypothesis than the dying, and didn't fit well with the dying brain hypothesis. Of course, I looked at the naturalistic hypotheses that people had suggested to see if they were really validated by the evidence, and I found that if you really look at the evidence, it's just not. And we can get into specifics if you want.
Absolutely, and we'll certainly do that. But I'm just curious, when you mention all of these experiences that you've studied, can you just pull out one experience that maybe made the hair stand up on the back of your neck?
It tends to not be just one experience. A lot of people like their evidence to rest on one really well-documented case that makes the hair stand up on your back. But the amazing thing to me is these experiences were everywhere, and so many of them were evidential. So like 4 to 6% of the United States, Australia, Germany, different places surveyed, that many people have reported near-death experiences. Deathbed experiences where similar things happened before a person's final death. When they interviewed people daily at a New York hospice, they found out that over 80%, up to 88% of these patients were experiencing like deceased relatives who had come to take them home, or seeing angels, or seeing God. So this is a huge number of people. So I'm more into just the great vast numbers of them to seeing what that means. But I'd have to say that in my first book on near-death experiences, one of the cases I looked up was one that Dr. Saboum, I keep my books here in front of me, Dr. Saboum, who I already mentioned, who taught at Emory. I have a lot of respect for him. I know him personally. He's a very careful researcher. He's not trying to write popular books. He's trying to get to what's going on. What he did was, when somebody first told him, I believe it was in 1975, shortly after Moody published his book, he heard a nurse talk about Moody's life after life. She said, "Oh, Dr. Saboum, I see that you're here. What do you think?" He said, "The kindest thing I could think to say was, I don't believe it." In fact, he would say later that his idea was hogwash. This is crazy stuff. He thought that when you die, you die. And he had never heard any of his patients talking about that. So the nurse wisely said, "Well, why don't you talk to some of your patients? I'm going to be sharing on this again, and I would like your expertise." And so he began to talk to his patients. And I think it was about the third one told him this wild story of what happened when he was supposed to be clinically dead. Saboum says, "Well, why didn't you tell me about this?" And I believe the patient said, "You're the last person I would tell something like that to. You're my physician, right? I mean, they're afraid they're going to send him to the psych ward or something. So you might tell a nurse, you might tell a close family member. Otherwise, you shut up about it so people won't take you to be crazy." But in a second book, so he did this study. About a year into the study, he determined the evidence shows that these patients are the patients who had a near-death experience and claimed to see themselves outside of their bodies. When I asked what happened during the resuscitation, and that can be very specific in each case, they always got it right. My cardiac patients who had a cardiac arrest but did not experience a near-death experience, he asked them, "What do you think happened in your procedure?" They always got significant details wrong. So about a year into his study, he said, the evidence shows these people were actually out of their bodies. Now, later on, after he published his first book, which is called Reflections of Death, during that time, I believe it was at Northside Hospital, another physician said, "You need to talk to a physician here who worked with a patient, Pam Reynolds, because hers," okay, this is the hair-raising type stuff. This is the one that's especially documented. The surgeon told Dr. Saboum, said, "There's this patient, she had an aneurysm. This thing could have burst and killed her at any moment. She went to have a specialized surgery in which they had to cool down her body, stop her heart and breathing, and go in and do the surgery while the blood was drained out of her head. During that time, her heart was being monitored carefully to make sure everything was stopped. There was no consciousness. Her brainstem was monitored. EEG was there monitoring. Everything was shut down. Her eyes were taped shut. There were 100 decibel clicks going on continuously in an ear to make sure that if anything was being perceived by her brain, that they would know it." So she was out of it. Her eyes were covered, and yet she came back talking about very specialized instruments that were used that Dr. Sabom didn't even know of, much less something you would have guessed from some TV show. So that one is in his second book, Light and Death. What Dr. Sabom did as a careful researcher is he talked to the surgeons, he looked at the medical records, he found the company that produced the instruments that she talked about that said it kind of looked like a toothbrush or something. And she said, my goodness, I'd never even seen these instruments. And so I was shocked to see them. But to see somebody that's that much clinically dead, nobody can say, oh, well, that happened before she was put to sleep, or she heard it. How could she hear it? You had the clicks going on. And I could give you many of these. In fact, you mentioned Dr. Habermas. He has a good list of very well documented evidentiary near-death experiences, just one after another after another.
Yeah, some of those documented evidences of these experiences are just fascinating to me, about individuals that were blind that can describe visuals that were taking place within the operating room in the tie of the doctors, for example, and they were totally blind. So some of those experiences it just blow me away. What about Steve? What about the hesitancy within the Christian community to even investigate this or put legitimacy possibly behind some of these experiences? Why are we so hesitant to all of a sudden say, well, this has got to not be true because it's dealing with something that we don't understand? Why within the Christian church are we hesitant to explore this?
Well, there are probably several reasons, and it differs from person to person. For me, 12 years ago, I'd never heard Christians talk about it. I'd read many books of apologists, and none of them had mentioned it. None of the ones that I'd read had mentioned that. So I just assumed that there was no evidence there. So I think many others assume if their favorite Christians that they respect are not mentioning it, if their pastors are not mentioning it in churches, that's one reason, is we just don't hear it, we're not aware, and so Christians have not jumped on this in the past. A second reason is that it's not coming out of our seminaries and pastors that are doing the research. These are typically, I'll say, secular researchers out there, like Dr. Sabom. He was teaching at Emory, right? He's just a cardiologist teaching at Emory. Others that were following these were cardiologists who were just about their business. And so this was not coming out of seminaries to where it would get published in the Christian literature. So I think many have just not heard about it. A second thing somebody noted was that in 1975, when Moody published his book, this was kind of the height of a New Age movement. You had a lot of that movement. A lot of people considered in academia, if you look at intellectual history, 1950s, a lot of people were proclaiming this is going to be the end of religion. Nobody's going to be talking about it anymore. Logical positivism was strong not only in philosophy, but also bled over into psychology and a lot of areas where people just said, we can't talk about evidences in religion. We can't even make sense out of religious language. A.J. Ayer's Language, Truth, and Logic, and others talking about this. So coming out of that area, you had a New Age movement come where people were saying, wow, but there is evidence that something else is going on. What about these experiences people have? And so people were latching on to those type experiences rather than looking to the Bible, which they thought had been explained away through biblical criticism. You were taught that typically in college. And so people were latching onto this. So 1975, that's kind of a height of the New Age movement. So some of these people in academia were very aware of New Age thoughts, and that was seemingly an intellectual option to believing traditional Christianity, but still believing that there's another world out there and there is some religious truth. Because of that, even today, you'll see a lot of people with New Age orientation or coming from Eastern religions who are saying, Oh, near-death experiences teach us these type truths, that all religions are fine or no religions are fine, that there's just the oneness of God, reincarnation. That turns a lot of Christians off because we hear it coming from that domain and we're saying, ooh, this must be a part of a cultish thing or a new age thing, has nothing to do with Christianity. And so some Christians, like John MacArthur, have read those paperback books promoting these things and have said, we need to be warned against that. And they called it heaven tourism and Christian publishing and said, we don't want to go there. And I agree with them. You don't just read paperback books and believe what they say, especially occultish type things. But most of these Christian authors didn't seem to even be familiar with the good research that had been done through the years by careful researchers and then compared it to the best of Christian theology.
And absolutely. And Steve, what do you think also, and you're touching on that as well, maybe some of the hesitancy to dive into this or explore it is because there are a lot of kooks out there that write books. And those books say that, everyone gets there and there are unicorns in heaven and so forth. Do you think that adds some, that puts in some hesitancy in folks to not want to dive into this?
I think it does. So like let's say that you look at YouTube and you search near-death experiences, and if you get the experiences that YouTube has selected through their algorithm to send you, these have been liked by most people, then they're often kind of way out experiences that may conform to a certain worldview, and that Christians, the first ones they look at, may be things that actually do contradict their faith. That's why I tell people, don't, as Solomon said in Proverbs, the naive believes everything he hears. We don't believe what every preacher says, even if he claims to be a Christian. We're not supposed to. We're supposed to be like the Bereans and study the scriptures ourselves and think them through. You don't believe every prophecy a person gives you. I don't care how godly they are. If it contradicts scripture, according to, if it's, Galatians 1, if it doesn't bear good fruit, we have specific objective things we can look at. We would expect within people's experiences that a certain percentage, I'm not sure what, some of these are on drugs. They didn't actually die. They're calling it a near-death experience because it may have some similarities, but they may have taken some LSD. They're giving their experience. Some people have mental illness. I know of one person who had, I think, a legitimate near-death experience, but the more you talk to him, he'll keep going into further experiences that he's had that get more and more wild and wild and wild. And then I found out that this was somebody who had been diagnosed with schizophrenia. And he was very obvious. He was getting messages from God all the time that he was writing down. And yet this person was interviewed by radio shows for his experience. So when Christians hear these experiences that don't resonate with their faith, it's easy to say, hey, I don't want any part of this. They're being wise, but we sometimes throw the baby out with the bathwater. It's kind of like saying, well, I don't believe in, healing because I saw this faith healer and he was really off the wall. Well, maybe there are legitimate miracles going on as well. Don't throw them all out. So I think the biblical balance is to say, don't believe everything you hear, but don't condemn everything you hear either. We risk quenching the spirit if we're saying that it's all of the devil when some of it's really of God. We risk believing the occult or demonic activities if we just accept everything. I think the balance is Paul in 1 Thessalonians 5. He says, do not quench the spirit. Do not despise prophetic utterances. That'd be, turning away something that might really be of God. But examine everything carefully. Hold fast to that which is good. So I think we need to think about each experience. Billy Graham would tell about, I think it was his mother-in-law who had a had an experience at death where she saw Jesus right before she died. And that was a very powerful event for him to share with people. He saw its power in preaching. Billy Graham, for you younger people, he's a very respected evangelist in the last generation. And I'm thinking, okay, well, that makes sense. She saw Jesus before she died. Why should I say that that was of the devil? You know, I don't think I can say that. The Bible doesn't say directly all these type things are of the devil. McQuilkin, Robertson McQuilkin was one of my most respected theologians, and he used to say it's easier to go to a consistent extreme than to stay in the center of biblical tension. And I think we can see that with a lot of charismatic versus non-charismatic, reformed versus more free will type things. There's a balance of Scripture that often it's just so easy to go to an extreme and dismiss all these experiences or believe them all. And really, we need to examine them, which is hard work, and we have to think them through and ask the questions of, do I really have reason to trust this person? Is it consistent with what God has said before? And apply biblical principles to think.
Think and use that critical thinking. Use this thing up here on occasion. Yeah. Steve, you've got another book. Is Christianity compatible with deathbed and near-death experiences? And in your research on the book, you talk about the surprising presence of Jesus. And you also talk about NDEs or near-death experiences from other cultures that have never really heard about Jesus. But kind of combine those, if you would, or talk about them, that theme of the surprising presence of Jesus across all cultures.
Yeah, this was a surprise finding. To me, I was fine if this were just another line of apologetics that gives us some basic things about the Christian worldview, but doesn't take it any further than the existence of God and the afterlife. I mean, let's say you're looking at the beginning of the universe, which the Big Bang theory would say that, as many physicists would put it, that space and time itself, these began at the Big Bang. Well, you look at that, and a lot of us would say, wow, that's pretty significant. I don't think that something could come from nothing. And then you look at the complexity of what was made, and a lot of us would conclude, wow, it makes sense that God exists. Now, that doesn't get us all the way to Jesus. That doesn't get us all the way to the Bible, but it's a start, and it makes us realize there is something else. There must be an intelligence behind all this. So I was fine with near-death experiences just being an experience with the other side, that globally everyone is seeing this being of light, which they tend to say is God, of course. They're communicating with it. It's a personal God. And so we have many things, in fact, 47 different items I saw where this was very compatible with conservative Christian theology. Again, God exists. He doesn't just exist, but he's a personal God. He's a loving God. There is an afterlife. Our deeds matter. You meet people on the other side that have been deceased for decades. Well, how does that jibe with people who believe that you're reincarnated shortly after death, if you're seeing people who are long deceased? And I saw those things in the Bible, like that Jesus in the Transfiguration. He talked to Moses and Elijah, who had been long since dead. That was not an occultish thing. We saw Stephen with a deathbed experience right before he was martyred. He looked up and had a vision of Jesus. We see the Apostle Paul in 2 Corinthians 12 having something that seems very similar to a near-death experience, where he was transported somehow into heavenly or to a paradise type place. So I saw many correspondences, but I'd never really looked into Jesus. Most of the scholars that I'd read, when they would report, and most of these would report at least one or two instances where one of their patients saw Jesus, but then they would tend to back off and say, well, but of course, if this had been a Buddhist, they would have probably reported it as Buddha, or if it was a Buddhist, Buddha. If it were a somebody from India, maybe they'd report Krishna, and they would just kind of blow it off and move on. So I assumed that people were seeing a being of light and calling him by the name of whatever he was used to calling the ultimate God. But when I got into it, I saw a preliminary study where someone had looked at sightings of Jesus in near-death experiences, and I thought, well, what I wanted to do was to take consecutive experiences as submitted to what's called the NDerf, NDERF website that Dr. Long has set up. He's got over 5,000 experiences individually submitted, so they're not making money off of it. They're just submitting their experience, so that takes away the money motive. But within those experiences, you've got to allow for a lot of anomalous cases because, again, some may be on drugs, some, you don't know the situation. We don't know the people. But one good thing about that is if you need a large number of cases, you can say, well, let's take consecutive cases, which I took the first one submitted to his site, and almost 150 cases and looked at them to see what percentage of these actually reported seeing Jesus. I was also interested in seeing how many of them reported anti-Christian doctrine, because many people I would talk to say, oh, when I go to YouTube, I just find all this stuff saying don't believe the Bible and drop church because that's not really where God is, and new agey stuff and whatever. So I wanted to see what percentage talked about reincarnation of other things. I found very few, and even some of them were questionable. Maybe 1 or 2% that talked about things like reincarnation or Christianity being wrong in certain basic doctrines. Very few were talking about seeing Muhammad. I didn't see any out of all the Muslims that I searched, or people from primarily Muslim countries. I didn't see any that were talking about seeing Muhammad on the other side. Very few reporting Krishna. In fact, when you get into these, you probably got more reporting aliens than you do some of these. So I think any legitimate researcher will put those in an anomalous category and set them aside. But when I looked at Jesus, there were 17 to 20% of them, which is 1 out of 5, saying that they saw Jesus. Now, I was shocked. So I looked at them because some of the scholars had said, oh, well, these are people that are seeing a being of light, and maybe they just call it Jesus because that's what they're expecting. But they didn't, the experiencers didn't put it like that. They would say, I know it was Jesus, or I saw the nail scars in his hand. Or one person I interviewed said, I don't know how I knew it was him. Really, I've thought about this, I've thought about it, and I've thought about it. How do I know it was him? I don't know. I can just say I knew it. I suspect that, like a lot of people, when they get to the other side, they have these unexpected experiences, like they were communicating with the angels or God mind to mind rather than verbally. So they just knew that this was an angel. You have children, for example, who will say at death, on the deathbed, or in a near-death experience, they'll say they saw an angel. And I say, well, what did it look like? And it didn't have wings often, typically, I'd say. Well, how did they know it was an angel? Well, I think they knew mind to mind with the angel who it was. Well, these people were sure that they saw Jesus. And some of them that I read from other researchers that had seen Jesus, they were not Christians. Some of them were Jews who were definitely not expecting to see Jesus on the other side, or some other religion. So I'm not sure what percentage of these might have actually been Christians. But even if it were just Christians, if you think about it, when people see deceased people on the other side, it's typically their relatives or people they knew. So what if Christians are seeing Jesus because they already knew him, but does that mean it was not Jesus? So I think it's still significant that you have that many. Now, some would say, well, 1 in 5, why wouldn't it be more than that? Well, in the near-death experience, things like the people going through a tunnel. You think, oh, that's something they all experience. Well, no, it may be 1 out of 5. It may be 17% or 18%. Some people just go to the other side, see everybody working on their bodies, have a glorious experience, see some beautiful things, and then come back. They don't experience the life review. But I think you need to nail down what is the core experience rather than taking a bunch of anomalous experiences. And to me, 1 out of 5 puts it within the core experience. So this was significant to me. And especially, you asked me about things that make the hair go up on your back. I was at a men's meeting with my church, and we had about 5 of us sitting around a table getting to know each other early one morning. And I was introducing myself. I was fairly new to the church. I said, well, I'm a professor at KSU. I study near-death and deathbed experiences. The fellow next to me says, oh, those things are real. I said, really? He said, yeah, I was. And he went on to tell me, and I interviewed him later, he was in a sepsis condition where they didn't know if he was going to live or die, comatose. And he had this very real experience with Jesus. The guy to my right had also had an experience with Jesus that was not a near-death experience. It was a visionary thing, but it was so meaningful to him maybe 30 years ago in his life that he couldn't hardly get through it without crying. Now, if you're evaluating testimonies in a court of law, these are the type people, they haven't written books on it. They don't tend to tell people about it. Sometimes they can't even get through the experience because it was so meaningful to them. I was just shocked. And it kind of put the icing on my apologetic cake when I had a historical apologetic arguing for Jesus' resurrection and Jesus being who he claimed to be. But when I saw people today seeing Jesus, people who said they know it for sure that they saw him. They're intelligent people, businessmen, bus drivers, regular people, but people I've known for a period of time. That, to me, kind of helped seal the deal for me, evidentially.
Steve, I'm curious, all of the NDE experiences that you've studied, in all of the books that you see, they're always positive experiences, or most of them. There are very few that you see are negative or hellish, I guess you could describe it as experiences. Talk about that. What type of, did you see any of those in your research about experiences when they were supposedly between this life and the next, that it wasn't a good experience? Can you describe that just a little bit?
Sure. So these would be called distressing or hellish experiences if you're studying it. Moody did find some of those in his original group of probably 150 people that he interviewed. He surmised that maybe these were people who tried to kill themselves. It was a suicidal type thing. Maybe they had that. He wasn't sure about it, but he acknowledged that some of them were there. Since then, some researchers didn't find them in their sets and just kind of assumed, well, maybe this is not a real near-death experience, and many kind of ignored it. In fact, in my first book, where I'm talking about just near-death experiences as evidence for the existence of God in heaven, my purpose was to show how these experiences argue for God in the afterlife. So there was really no reason for me to deal with the question of, are some of these actually distressing? So I just had maybe a paragraph saying, hey, some of these are distressing, went on. Besides, they give me the creeps. Who likes to talk about stuff like that? And I think a lot of the more New Age people just want to say everything's good on the other side, because some of these want to be open to going to the other side and toying with the other side with mediums and with others who, through channeling and doing all these things, they want to assume that everything on the other side is good. But over time, researchers began to be a little more diligent studying these. Nancy Evans Bush wrote a book called Dancing Past the Dark. She had her own distressing experience. She worked with IONS, the kind of near-death experience organization, for years. Didn't tell anybody, I think, for decades. She had had one, but she studied other people's experiences. And then there was another book, Blessing in Disguise, by Romer, Rommer, a physician in Florida who studied a lot of these. I really like Romer's book because it gives a lot of these experiences that you can look at and compare. These experiences, and if you look at people who studied them and put together characteristics, often they are seeing not just angels, but they'll see demonic beings. There are intelligences on the other side that are wanting to torment or lie to them, that do not have their best interests in mind. It's shocking. It's horrible. Sometimes a person will be with Jesus on the other side, and Jesus will say, I want you to see the other side here. It may give them a glimpse of what's going on in a hellish realm. But to me, it's very consistent with what the Bible talks about as far as descriptions of hell. I think some of this in the Bible may be symbolic in some ways, because you've got a place that's a lake of fire. Well, normally you don't think of a lake of water being on fire. And then a bottomless pit. Is that really like a lake of fire? So either there are different types of terrains in hell, or some of this is symbolic. But it's not symbolic of a big beer party where lost people just get together and have fun after. If that's symbolic, it's symbolic of something bad. So these are people who come back, again, like in a regular positive near-death experience, they'll say, it was real. I was on the other side, and it was not good. Their typical response is to believe that and to think that somehow they need to change their life. They need to repent, and they tend to get involved in some more conservative religious church or something, because they are very much scared by it. Now, some people would, and as far as how many are we talking about, Bush and others would say maybe, again, 20%, kind of like the Jesus ones. Some people would say, well, wait a minute, if most people are lost, why aren't the lost all experiencing distressing experiences? Well, I think that God gives each person what they need. Let's say somebody grew up in a very legalistic church, or grew up in a family that was claiming to be Christian, but they're very inconsistent and mean. Some of these people, even though they're denying God, denying Christianity, maybe living a very sinful life, they're confused. Why wouldn't God show his love to them to let them know, I love you? After all, according to Peter said, God is patient toward you, not wishing that any should perish, but all should come to repentance. So God wants all these people who are having these experiences to come to him. And I believe his end game is to get people in heaven, not because they're scared to death, but because they love him. So Paul said in Romans 2, the kindness of God leads us to repentance. So I think he wants to woo people with his love. Therefore, most of the ones that I see tend to be positive, whether they're Christians or non-Christians, whether they're living good lives or bad lives. I think that makes sense. Jesus was really harsh with the religious leaders who should have known better, who were leading people astray. But to just regular, everyday sinners, tax gatherers, prostitutes, and all that, he was very kind. Well, Jesus preached and said, why should we be kind to mean people? Because he says that he himself, God the Father, is kind toward wicked people, ungrateful and wicked men. He himself is kind toward them. So I think God is being kind toward many people. Now, maybe it's a lot higher than 50% though, because what Bush and others found was that if people are extremely reluctant to talk about their good near-death experience, how much more reluctant are they to talk about a negative one or to submit it to some website? So I think we don't hear it as much, and that's what one cardiologist said, Dr. Rawlings, who's a very competent cardiologist as well. He had experiences with his patients where he saw them experiencing hell, and it was so powerful that they would just kind of block it from their memories of the future. So he surmised that up to 50% were having these type distressing experiences.
Well, fascinating information, fascinating study. Steve, I'm curious, folks that are listening maybe by podcast or they're watching this program, and you've piqued their interest to study near-death experiences, and that they may not have a relationship with God whatsoever, but they're interested. What does the Jesus of the Bible have to say about after death? Does he have any information, any good information to go by? What would he say to them?
Well, from my study, and this takes, so near-death and deathbed experiences, that's just one avenue of evidence that me, with my skeptical mind, wanted to look into. I believe that's very consistent with what I see in the Bible. You know, I see Jesus on the other side. I see a personal God on the other side. So if you're a seeker and you don't necessarily believe in Jesus or God, or, you know, you're just kind of seeking out there, I think it's good to look into near-death experiences to see what you find from them. But I believe that one of the main purposes of these experiences is not to fill in all your theology, but to start you legitimately seeking. So when I was going through my doubting, to the doubters and questioners out there, when I was going through my doubting, I would pray regularly to God, even if it was just, God, if you're up there, let me know if you're up there. And it's not like it would immediately get answered. But Jesus said, seek and ye shall find. And in the original Greek, that's a present tense word. Seek and keep on seeking, and you shall find. And sometimes I might be through months and months and months of seeking. But eventually, God helped me. Number two, get into the Bible. Okay, if Jesus is indeed on the other side, you want to see what the best documents say about him. And from my research, the New Testament documents, the letters, the Gospels, and all these are the earliest documents, the most accurate on Jesus' life. Now, people say, oh, they've been through all these translations, you can't believe it. Well, I studied Greek, I studied Hebrew, so that I could look at these and interpret them in their original languages. I think these are darn good manuscripts, very good history. So look to Jesus. Even if you're doubting the whole Bible, so many skeptics that I read just haven't even seemingly read the Bible for themselves, and I think there's power in the scriptures. Read the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Read Acts to see how these people spread the word. Notice how they dealt with evidence. They didn't tell people to believe blindly. They told them, encouraged them to look at the evidence. So I prayed. I made sure my heart was open to receive him if he was real, because if any man is willing to do his will, he'll know the teaching. And then so I was reading the Bible, and I also stuck with other Christians who were not just any Christians, but the kind who were openly seeking God and were open to talk to, because I needed the mutual encouragement from them in order to not go astray in some weird way. Ultimately, I believe what Jesus said about the afterlife. God so loved the world. This is confirmed in near-death experiences. People say this is the most loving being I've ever seen. All wise, all just, loving. Whatever bad things have happened to them in this life, they go to the other side. Okay, whatever the case, he is loving. God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that being Jesus. Whoever believes in him, that's being kind of trusts in him, puts their life into his hands. Whoever believes in him should not perish but have eternal life. So I believe that Jesus was our Savior, and that we need to deal with him and try to understand why he came and what he wants out of our life. And it may take seeking. If my books can help you, I'm at jstevemiller@gmail.com. That's the letter J, Steve Miller. I'll send you a free PDF of any of my books. Because I'm not out to make money off of these. I write them because I feel like they need to be written. I'm trying to get closer to the truth.
Well, and I highly encourage you to go to that website, folks. If you're listening or watching, you can simply go to that website. And once again, Steve, help me with that web address once again.
J. Steve Miller, I believe it's .info. I had several of my web addresses hijacked recently, but
Okay.
you ought to see my face on there.
Okay. Yeah, and I just pulled it up. So it's jstevemiller.info, not the singer, but jstevemiller.info.
You won't hear any good music there, but you can keep up with me there.
Absolutely. And so, Steve, what's on your agenda? What are you working on currently? What's on your calendar?
I'm actually working on my fourth book on the same area. So I wrote one on near-death experiences, one on deathbed experiences, which is less talked about today, but I think is quite evidential, and then the one comparing Christianity to near-death and deathbed experiences. This one I want to really try to give the skeptics more attention and say, why do so many people, that otherwise respectable intellectuals, why do they claim that all this religious stuff is just silly? Why do they think that there is no afterlife and proclaim it very boldly as if there's no evidence? So I want to give them a chance. I also want to talk more about the methodology that I'm using to show that it's scientific. So I'm working on that now and trying to understand. Now, I've already dealt with in my first book a lot of the critiques of near-death experiences by skeptics, but I'm saying, why are they proclaiming that there is no God and that there is no afterlife? Do they have any evidence there? So far, I'm finding they just don't tend to study the evidence, but I do want to make sure and give them a chance in case there's something I've missed.
Wow. And it seems like a fascinating subject, and I can't wait for that, your book to come out on that. But Steve, and thank you so much for coming on the program. And again, Steve can be found at jstevemiller.info. Steve, as we leave here, anything you want to add?
You know, Jesus once said, "What is it a profit of man to gain the whole world and forfeit or lose himself or his soul?" And I think the near-death and deathbed experiences validate the biblical teaching that we are more than just a body, that there is actually a soul that will go on living after it. And I just want to encourage you that these values make sense. Living for things that will last for eternity. It gave me so much meaning starting as a sophomore in high school, even though I've had to go through a lot of hard things, doubts and questions in life, the loss of my first wife to cancer. But all these things, life's not been easy, but it's been so meaningful. And I just want to encourage people, if you're at a doubting stage, keep seeking. If you've taken a wrong path, I just tell you, it's not worth it. Come back, get your life right with the Lord, and it can make all the difference in the world.
Absolutely. Sound and wise advice. Steve, thank you so much for coming on the program today.
Thanks for having me, Tony.